Welcome to the Voice of Meaning. Today's episode is I'm going to interview my really good buddy and partner in crime in this enterprise, Ulrich Semrau. And I met Ulrich 10 years ago or so in the town of Republic, Washington, where he hung out a lot while his wife was working. And I had lots of very interesting conversations with him, either at the co-op over coffee or at the brewery over a beer. And one of the unique things that I discovered about Ulrich is that he was made the town philosopher of the city of Republic. Can you explain that, Ulrich?
Yeah, I'll try. um, the town government was having a pretty bad week one week, and I thought I'd cheer them up a little bit. So I went to the council meeting, and I made a suggestion that they appoint me town philosopher. And the reason I said they ought to do that is that there are no town philosophers in the United States, not officially. And I mean, there's the guy at the brewery or at the pub that philosophize, but not an official officer of the city. So I told them it would be really good advertising for the town. So they vote. Oh, and one of the councilmen says, "Well, before we vote, I want to ask you a question." It said, "What philosophy do you espouse?" And I said, "Well, I'm not quite sure, because all philosophies are interesting to me." So he says, "Okay, right question," and then it was unanimous. It was a unanimous vote.
Interesting.
So I've been. I think I was in a parade once, one of the Prospector Day parades. Anyway, it was a fun thing to do.
And by the way, Prospector Days is a fun little local holiday celebrating the rich mining tradition of Republic, Washington. And it's always the second weekend in June. And if any of you who are in the area, please come. They've got lots of doings. And if you Google Prospector Days Republic, Washington, you'll get more information. But this is about you, Ulrich, and we've been good friends since, and we've had many, many philosophical and interesting conversations over the years. Want to learn a little bit about how you came into existence. So can you share some of your interesting history and even the history of before you were born?
Well, first, I was born in southern Germany in 1950, not long after the war. And in fact, I was born in a refugee camp. My parents were displaced people. Our home in the east had been destroyed by the Russians. And my dad, when I was 5 years old, sat me down and he says, "I want you to remember where we came from. It's important to remember the past." And so, being five, I said, "Okay." And that's sort of been a focal point for most of my life, of things that I've studied and done, and interests I have. And even my son has a strong interest in the home area, which used to be called the city of Danzig, which between the wars was a free city, and it had its own government, and it was under the protection of the League of Nations, and had a commissioner who lived there. anyway, so, and before that, it was part of the Prussian kingdom. So my interests have gone back in time to find out, well, where did we come from? Why is that important? Uh, um, why is knowing one's past important for being able to live in the present? And so from that point, in the 56, a few years later, my parents wanted to emigrate. The home was gone. Now it's in Poland. Even though they both spoke Polish, it wasn't safe to go back. And and in the meantime, after I was born, my dad became a teacher in Stuttgart, which is in Swabia, southern Germany, and became a teacher at one of the Waldorf schools there. Not the original one in town, in Stuttgart, but there was a second one that was built after the war. And I spent a lot of time as a little inquisitive kid with him and his students in the student garden. My dad was a botany and biology teacher and developed this amazing school garden with all kinds of herbs and plants and berry bushes and things. So those are images in my mind. And I got myself into trouble there too. One time I had a bucket of lye that I found, and I put it in my little pail, and I was running down the hill, and I slipped, and it blew all over me. And so my dad dunked me head first in this big water trough that they had for watering plants, so it wouldn't be hurt. So I got in trouble a lot. In fact, sort of a story which sort of has framed a lot of my life is when I was about 4 years old, I think. I was in a crib, supposed to take my afternoon nap. I didn't like taking naps, so the window was open. The crib was right next to it. I got it into my head, out the window, dropped down to the ground, went to the front gate, figured out how to open it up, and down the street I went. Well, I knew I knew where my dad worked and with direction. So I started walking. It was about 7 miles, and somebody found me about halfway. This lady who had a daughter my age saw me all by myself marching down the street. And she asked me where I was going. I said, to the school where my dad works. And fortunately, she was part of the Waldorf community, so she knew everybody. So anyway, things that could have gone bad didn't. And that was my first personal adventure that I remember.
So you remember this directly or not, or through stories that people told you about that?
I remember it directly. I remember it from stories. My mom didn't take it very well. And there's the whole story about that. But and I go there to that area in Google Earth, and I followed my path, and I'm still wondering how I survived. I mean, I crossed a 4-lane, I guess you would call it a highway, intersection, and there were actually 6 streets that came together at the same place. I just walked right across it. I didn't look either side or anything. and I don't remember any screeching of tires.
Well, I'm
Uh,
glad you weren't run over. But I'm going to ask you to go back further in time to before you were born, and which side of the war was your family on? I remember in talking with you that your mother was on a boat that sank, and she was one of very few survivors. That you're very lucky to have been born at all. Can you reflect on both your parents' adventures during World War II?
okay. Well, they were citizens of the Free State of Danzig until the 1st of September 1939, when the Germans attacked Poland and brought Danzig back into the Reich. And my dad, he was at 3 o'clock in the morning. My uncle had asked him to stay with his family. Something big was going to happen. He couldn't say what it was, and so my dad was on the couch when the shelling started and fell off the couch. His concern were his glass greenhouses at that point, but he also said he understood that their lives were changed forever, and they were. My dad was fortunate enough. He was um, what's the word for going into the army?
Was he drafted?
He was drafted 3 times.
Into which army?
The German army. Yeah.
Because the Germans took over the Free State of Danzig.
Yeah, and they were German citizens again.
So where did he serve?
He served in France as anti-aircraft, and ended up on the island of Jersey, between Calais, France, and England. And when the war ended, they got a phone call and said the war was over. We'll be picking you guys in 2 weeks. So he was relatively safe. The interesting thing is that every anti-aircraft installation that group that they replaced had been wiped out, and every group that replaced them got wiped out. But in the entire latter part of the war, he only saw 2 days of actual military action. So he always said he had a guardian angel.
Wasn't he captured and interned in UK for a while?
Yeah, he was on the island of Jersey, and the British, they surrendered by telephone, and the British came 2 weeks later and took them to England and marched them up to Scotland, where he was interred in a camp there. And their job was cutting trees for supports for coal mines that they had up there. So
he was there for quite a while after the war. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was there from 1945 until 1948.
So even though the war was over, the British kept prisoners of war to do work.
Yeah, well, they actually kept, when he left, there were several ships coming in from the United States from released POWs, who were then taken by the English and kept until 1953.
It's a very interesting piece of history that I never learned until I spoke with you.
Yeah.
Talk about your mother's story. It was a pretty harrowing experience too, right?
Okay, well, that leads, in a sense, that leads to my father's side of the family was German, and originally came from, they were part of a tribe called the Samugalians, up by south of Riga, not very far, not that far from Danzig, and basically had lived in that region for, as far as I can figure out, 3,000 years. And my mother's side was more mysterious. I never really got clear answers to questions that I had. So I always suspected there was something different than what I thought. Well, it turned out, after I did some genetic testing, is that that side of the family was Jewish. So most of that history is more, it was implied, was never spoken about. If I, as I was growing up, if I asked certain questions, I was shut down. Not they were, my mother especially was terrified about the secret of being Jewish coming out, until she died.
It's interesting. And wasn't she evacuated from Danzig because of all the bombing and stuff?
Yeah, at that, this was in the tail end of the war. The Russian armies had encircled pretty much the city, and they basically left it for special treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's part of the story I'm not clear of yet, but I had a brother who was 4 months old, and I'm, as far as I can reconstruct it, my mom had actually been arrested and was in a place called Stutthof, a concentration camp, for a very short period of time. Someone in that was there on the German side recognized her, and recognized my dad's family, and got her out of there with my brother. And so they went back into the city, and they had to evacuate, and she got on a ship called the Goya, which was an old freighter, and it had already taken over 25,000 refugees to Denmark. So she got on the ship, and they left it in the evening, and they wanted the cover of darkness to be able to get out. They knew there were Russian submarines out there, and just as they got out of the harbor, they were torpedoed. Two torpedoes hit the ship in the middle, and my mom just happened to be on deck smoking a cigarette, and and my brother was with somebody else in the family down below deck, and that cigarette saved my mom's life. She was able to get off the ship. She was one of, they know there were at least 8,000 people on board, and most likely more. And she was one of 4 civilians that survived.
Wow.
There were about 180 injured military. The ship was designated as a Red Cross ship. It had a big Red Cross painted on it, but the Russians didn't care. So she got off the ship, and it was gone in 5 minutes. It wasn't something where it lingered and lingered. So she went back. She met up with her uncle, who was going to take a group and go west. And of course, there was no gas, so there was a horse in front of the pulling the car and then a few days later, the horse died, and they literally walked from Danzig, which is now called Gdansk in Polish, to Berlin. And she arrived in Berlin 2 days before the Russian army did.
And they survived the Battle of Berlin, obviously.
Yeah.
So you lost a 4-month-old brother before you were born, and of course you weren't conceived yet, because I know that you and I are both 1950 babies. How did your parents reunite? Because they must have been separated for several years.
Yeah. The Red Cross, as soon as the war was over, the Red Cross started creating lists of people who were displaced, who were in the military and where they were. And the idea was people contacted the Red Cross and then were connected with their, the people they were looking for. So my aunt found out where my dad was. And so that was the first part, and told my dad that she had been in contact with my mom in Berlin. And when my dad was released in 1948, he made it to Berlin. He was told by the English, don't go into the Russian sector. Don't do that, because they have groups of soldiers that look for newly released German soldiers, and they take them to Siberia. You don't want to do that. And the Berlin Wall did not exist yet at that time. So he went there anyway. My mom was in the Russian sector, and he kidnapped her, and they went south to where my aunt was, which was in a place called Straubing, Bavaria, which is not very far from Regensburg, and also on the Czech border. So that's when that part of the family got reconnected. And my dad already knew that his parents were gone, and most of the rest of the family were gone.
So where were your parents in 1950 when you were born?
This place called Straubing.
So they were in Straubing.
Yeah.
And then what? A little more about their odyssey afterwards. You said your dad became a teacher in Stuttgart area.
Yeah, my dad was a landscape architect. He
Got
was
it.
he was a landscape designer. That was his job before the war. He was in charge of building parks and memorial places in Danzig. And and well, to back up a little bit, he had been one of the original students at the original Waldorf School, which is the school system that Rudolf Steiner designed. And so he had a connection with Stuttgart, and somehow he connected with them, and they needed teachers, since the Rudolf Steiner's groups, the Anthroposophical Society, the schools, they were on the top of the list of the Nazis to be banned. And
I think we're going to have a whole episode on Steiner and that movement and that philosophy at a later time. I just find that whole movement very fascinating.
Yeah, my dad said that having been a Waldorf student is what saved his life in the war. He had a different way of looking at things. When they marched him to the camp to Scotland, about a third of his group were dead within a month. They gave up. They basically put a blanket over their head on their cots and died
How sad.
from lack of meaning.
Interesting.
And so what did my dad do? Well, he says we've got to do things. We have to keep busy. So he says what we're going to do. Told the guys, he said we're gonna create a theater. We're gonna write a play. We're gonna all be part of the play. We're all gonna practice the play, and then we're gonna invite the camp guards to come and watch the play. And in the meantime, he also he asked the commander of the camp for permission to have a building that they could use to do this with. And so he said, well, fine, keep the prisoners out of trouble. And so he helped my dad, being a landscape architect, also landscaped the outside of it and made it look nice. And that's what they did. And then later on, they organized, one guy was a watchmaker, and he started making little steam trains out of tin cans and garbage, and they sold them to the camp guards. And later on, they needed a bigger market. So my dad became the salesman, and he managed to get over the fence and hiked into Edinburgh and went door to door selling the things that the camp guys, the prisoners, had made.
So your dad was an entrepreneur, among other things.
He had a lot of courage. I learned
Yeah,
probably the most important lessons of my lives from him.
I think you need to write a book about their lives. And I'm wondering, when the book becomes a movie, who would act the role of your parents? Just quickly, how did they end up immigrating to the United States, or emigrating to the United States?
Well, that came out of, they had two other couples that they played cards with, gin rummy, every once a week. And somehow the conversation came about emigrating. All three couples had come from the East. Their homes were gone. They didn't feel comfortable in West Germany. So they decided to look where to go. And first, my dad said, we're going to go to Colombia. And he found out that he could get a bunch of land to grow bananas, but he'd have to hack it out of the jungle. And he thought that was exciting. My dad was an adventurer, but my mom found out about snakes. And that was the end of that thought. But we had relatives in the United States since the 1700s. So that's where we ended up. First, we came into New York. I still remember seeing the Statue of Liberty for the first time. And we actually were scheduled to be on a ship called the Andrea Doria. But I had injured myself 2 days before sailing. So we missed that ship, and we got on an old American troop transport ship. And but the Andrea Doria hit another ship and sunk 2 days before. Well, 2 days before we got to where, it wasn't very far from New York. And so I have pictures still in my dad's diary of all the debris floating in the water when we went over the site. And
Unbelievable.
so
So,
that was the
yeah.
second ship that was important in my life.
Wow. Wow. And they immigrated, as I recall, in 1956, did you say?
1956,
Yeah.
and
And you remember that pretty well too.
yeah, a friend of mine who we emigrated with, she was 8 and I was 5, and she sent me a picture that her parents had of me sitting on a crate New York Harbor on a pier with a tag, a yellow tag on me telling who I was and where I was supposed to go.
Yeah.
And then we only stayed in New York a little while, and then we went to a place in the wilderness of America called Peacock Lake, Minnesota. And that's where the first year, that's where we settled in.
Wow. You know, to risk a cliche, you can't make this stuff up. It's, you know, your life was saved before you were born by your mother smoking a cigarette and your dad finding meaning in life in a POW camp. And then you survived because you were injured and couldn't make a ship that was doomed. Amazing. I think we're going to pause here. Ulrich, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful initial interview, which I think will be the first of many. Please, if you have not already subscribed to the Voice of Meaning, subscribe. Any comments, we will answer and get back with you. There's a little bell in the upper part of your YouTube video. If you press the bell, then you can be, and subscribe, you can be notified of future videos. And we would appreciate any suggestions and input in our emerging attempt to help people with their meaning in life and discover meaningful things. Ulrich, do you have anything else to add before we say goodbye?
Yeah, well, thanks for interviewing me. And um, this is sort of the foundational, when we think about how our lives grow and what becomes important, becomes not important. Our early experiences and the experiences of the families from which we came have a lot to do with this. And just as sort of to tie it up, I became a psychotherapist many years later, specifically studying Jungian psychology. And so one of the things I had to do was go through my own analysis, so I wouldn't have any baggage that to interfere. Anyway, one of the things that came out is that I tend to be on the edge of things, on the boundary or the border of things. And so, on the border of not existing and existing, on the border of being German and being Jewish, and on the border of being a refugee and finding a new home in the new world, and all these things. They're all stories that create meaning in one's life. And I'm not the only one. I mean, currently there are over 25 million refugees in the world, and each one has a story.
Right. And we both live in areas that were on the frontier or in the frontier as well.
Well,
And more later.
as
And
my doctor said, we don't practice rural medicine here. We practice frontier medicine.
correct. Okay. Well, thank you, Ulrich, and thank you all of those who are watching and those who wish to comment and help us along. If you would like to be interviewed on The Voice of Meaning, please let us know. We want to give visibility to people who ordinarily would not be very visible. And as you see, I think Ulrich's story was, and his parents' story was unbelievable. incredible. And thanks again. All right.
Thank you.